If you're unfamiliar, I am Liz and I am a metalsmith, jeweler, whatever you want to call it. I make jewelry with metal and gemstones and stuff. I do rent an art studio where I have a cute little jeweler's bench and sometimes I make jewelry. But sometimes I do like to work at home on this little table in my kitchen. As someone who wants to do every single craft and learn how to make art in every single medium that exists, I know it can be daunting starting something new and trying to figure out what tools to get and how to do the thing, especially something like metalsmithing where it seems like you need a fancy table specifically for making jewelry or your own studio or all these extravagant tools. It might not seem like a craft that you can do at your kitchen table in your overly priced apartment with paper thin walls where you can hear your neighbors sneezing. But I'm here to tell you, you can do whatever the hell you put your mind to. Will people be mad? I mean, no, probably not. Not if you do it at respectful hours. Unlike me, it is nighttime, but I'm gonna be as quiet as I can. And while I'm here and while I have all my tools here, I thought it would be fun to show you that you can make something in your kitchen. If metalsmithing is something you've always wanted to give a try, but you don't have the means to get a separate studio or to get a jeweler's bench, you can do it on a table that you don't care that much about. Don't do it on your $2,000 Ashley Furniture home store. Do it on some little Amazon guy, or better yet, something from the thrift store. So yeah, I'm gonna show you how to make a little simple ring with this little round onyx gemstone. If you don't feel ready to work with a gemstone and you wanna start out just with like a simpler project, I do have a video a little bit further down on my page where I show you how to make a really simple stamped ring. No gemstones involved, so check that out if you want. You are gonna need to invest in quite a few tools to make this happen, but I'm gonna try to break this down to like be as beginner friendly as possible. I'm gonna assume that everybody does not have a rotary tool or a flex shaft. We're gonna make this ring with no power tools, just sandpaper. We're traveling back to simpler times. We could make this in Little House on the Prairie times. I mean, maybe not. They probably didn't have butane torches back then. But let's pretend our electricity is out and we wanna make a ring. If you do wanna do this long term and you want like a nice, shiny, polished finish, you're gonna wanna invest in some kind of a rotary tool. I've had my flex shaft for 10 years and it's still working great. And honestly, I've never serviced it. You're supposed to like lube it, oil it, I don't know. I've never done that. In 10 years and mine works just fine. So flex shafts are great, but they are expensive. I think they're like 300 bucks. You can get similar tools from Dremel at like Home Depot, Lowe's. I think those are much cheaper. But today we're just using sandpaper and files. So here are the tools you're gonna need to make this little ring. First and foremost, you're gonna need a butane torch. Doesn't have to be pink, but that does make life more fun. You're also going to need a soldering station so you don't light your table on fire. My favorite is a turntable with a solderite block. A third hand is also vital for this project, and if you don't happen to have one naturally growing from your body, you can pick up an artificial one like this. We're making a ring, so you'll most definitely need a ring mandrel to be able to round out your band and measure the size. To help with the ring rounding, you're gonna also need a soft mallet. This one is rawhide. I got it at an antique store, but if you're vegan, plastic or wooden will also work. Files are also super important, and personally, I prefer a number 2 half round, but on a budget, you could get a set of small files from Amazon. These are French shears, and they're super useful for cutting metal, which you'll do a lot of if you become a metalsmith. You are definitely going to need some tweezers, not your nose hair pluckers, but something long and pointy. Sharpies are a really good tool to have around, as are calipers, so that you can get really precise measurements. A good respirator will not only protect your vital organs, but it will also make you feel cool as hell, and you can take selfies and post them on the internet and brag to your friends about how you're a jeweler now. He's a little jeweler. He's a little jeweler. Oh, why is it spicy? Okay, back to the tools. Flux, aka Forbidden Gatorade, cleans your metal and is essential to the soldering process. A set of pliers is really good to have around, but if you are going to just get one, I recommend a nice good pair of needle nose. For any metalsmithing that involves bezel set gemstones, you're going to need a burnisher and a bezel pusher. You're going to need some water, and personally I like to keep mine in a jar with a lid so that my cats don't drink it. You'll need solder, and we're going to go into a lot more detail about this later on in the video. You're going to need a pretty little gemstone cabochon. Make sure it has a totally flat back. You will also need some band wire, of course. I'm using 10 gauge full round sterling silver wire, but I will leave other options for different kinds of band wire in the description. Sterling silver sheet is also essential for this project. I'm using 22 gauge. Bezel is the super thin wire that holds your stone in place, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit later. And since we're not using power tools, you're going to need sandpaper in various grits. This is a bench pin. Bench pins are awesome and they clamp onto the edge of your table super easily. They help you saw and just generally are a good anchor point for anything you're doing. Also, yes, I did tape a plastic bag to the underside of my table to catch scraps. This gorgeous jeweler's saw is from Green Lion. It's my favorite possession in the world, and I love jeweler's saws. If you're gonna get one, you're gonna need saw blades and you're gonna need some lube. A ring clamp is not necessary, but so helpful for setting stones. You'll see me use this later on. And if you want to oxidize your jewelry, which I always do, you're gonna need some liver of sulfur. This stuff smells like actual farts, but it's pretty great. I don't know how to be normal when showing supplies, so hopefully you got something out of that. We're gonna start now on the bezel for this little onyx gemstone. Choosing the right bezel height for your stone is kind of a hard thing to teach. It's something that you'll learn with practice, and you'll learn your specific preferences. That's with a lot of metalsmithing. You're gonna definitely buy a bunch of wires, bezels, and gauges of silver, and you're gonna get it and you're gonna say, ugh, I don't like this one. I wish it was thicker, I wish it was thinner, I wish it wasn't so hard, whatever. I've been doing this for over 10 years and that still happens to me, so that's gonna happen. But basically, you wanna turn your stone sideways and take your bezel wire, hold it up to the side of your stone, and just see where the wire is hitting on your stone. You don't want it to come up over top of your stone very far. This stone's got kind of like a high dome, and you just want the bezel wire to be able to kind of cup the edge of the stone to keep it in the setting. So to me, this wire for this stone looks right. This is the bezel wire I'm using. I'll link this below. Not that you're gonna have the exact same stone as me. I would recommend getting several different heights. I personally always go for the 28 gauge. I think that that's a good gauge. It's not too hard to push over. Some are too thick where it's like really hard to push it over. I think 28 gauge is a nice happy medium. So now that I've found the bezel wire I want to use, I'm gonna put it up against my stone and hold it on there while I push it all the way around and wrap the stone tightly in silver all the way around the edge. Then you're gonna take a Sharpie and you're gonna mark where you need to cut it, and then take your shears and as straight as you can, you're gonna cut. Then you're gonna put the bezel around your stone. It's easier to sit it on a flat surface so you can see if it's overlapping, if you need to trim a little bit, or if you cut it way too short and you need to cut a new piece. Mine seems to be a little bit big. It's overlapping just a little bit there. So I'm gonna take my shears and just trim off a very small little bit here until I get it to fit pretty much perfectly. If there's a little bit of a gap, if it's a little tiny bit too big, that's usually okay. You'd much rather it be too big than too small. If it's like barely touching and you have to like squeeze it really hard to get it to touch, cut a new piece. Now we're gonna do our very first solder. It's very exciting. You're gonna take your bezel off and you're gonna move your stone somewhere far away from fire. And you're gonna use your pliers to kind of bend the ends of this circle of bezel wire. You can flatten them out a little bit so that instead of being perfectly round, it makes a little bit more of like a D shape, just so these two ends line up really flush. You can use your fingers. This bezel wire is very soft, so you really don't even need the pliers necessarily. And you're gonna work with this metal until you get those ends really flush. If you can't quite seem to get them flush, you might need to take a file. Some of the ends might be like a little crooked, or maybe take your shears and just barely cut it so that it's very straight so that they can match up perfectly. And then I like to dip my entire bezel in the flux, find a flat spot on your soldering block and sit that there. You'll take a really small little piece of hard flow solder and use your tweezers to position the joint of this bezel right on top of that piece of solder. Respirator checkpoint. Put on your respirator before you solder every single time. Your lungs will thank you for that.
Yay, our first solder. Okay, keep in mind here that bezel wire is very thin and it can melt super easily. So if you have a big torch like mine, you're gonna want to use the lowest setting possible for your flame. You can see that I'm moving my flame on and off of the metal very quickly, and I'm focusing the tip of that blue cone right on the solder seam. After only a few seconds, you will see the solder go up through the gap, and then turn off your torch and quench in water.
Now you want to check that this fits your stone. Put your stone out on a flat surface, push the bezel over it. I can tell that mine fits nicely, but it's a little bit misshapen, so you can kind of roll the stone and the bezel on a flat surface to get this to become round again, because we had to kind of flatten it to solder it. And if you can pick up your stone and plop it right in there without it being way too loose, but with it being able to come in and out of your bezel easily, you've done good work. Now that I've got it soldered, I can see that this bezel wire is a little bit too tall for my stone, which is a super easy fix with some sandpaper. I like to use a pretty soft sandpaper for this, not one that's like super gritty. This one is 220 grit. And you're gonna wanna sand your bezel regardless of if it is too tall or not. If it's not too tall, you just wanna sand it enough that the bezel is really flush with the table or with the silver that you're going to be soldering it onto. So just sand it until it sits really flat on your table. If your bezel is too tall for your stone, then you're just going to sand it a little longer so that it gets a little bit shorter. You're just going to keep wanting to go back and forth, checking if it fits your stone nicely. I like to just take one finger, put it on top of the bezel, and kind of go in circles or in figure eights or back and forth. I like to flip it over, do the same thing on the other side, flip them back and forth, and periodically check it with my stone.
It is a little bit hard to explain this, but hopefully this is a better visual. So here's the wire at the height that it started at. You can see that it's too tall because there's a lot of space between the wire and the curve of the stone. There's a big gap there all the way around. And then here is the bezel after I sanded it to the perfect height. You can see how much more snugly it fits and hugs the stone, and that it will just cup the edge rather than smothering the entire top of the cabochon. And then here you can see how flat the bezel sits on my bench pin after sanding the bottom of it.
I dropped my bezel and I was looking for it for 15 minutes, and I'm so sorry to report that if you take up metalsmithing as a hobby, you will be doing this a lot, very often. And if you have way too many animals like me, you'll be looking in every crevice of your floor wondering why these mother effers shed so much. I just slept. But then maybe you might also find a prize, which this time for me it was a cat whisker, which I promptly added to my bag of falling cat whiskers. There is a craft here somewhere, I know it, so when I think of it, I'll be ready. Unfortunately, I did not find my bezel. It's still somewhere on my kitchen floor. I gave up and decided to make another one, which is easier sometimes, and sometimes you just gotta let the floor monster, which is much like the dryer sock-eating monster, you just gotta let him win. Just gotta surrender. So here's bezel number 2. It is sanded, it fits my stone beautifully, and now we are ready for solder number 2, where we're gonna solder this bezel wire onto our back plate, which is the flat sheet of metal that's gonna keep your stone where it should be. I already cut my back plate out of this big sheet of silver. I did that much earlier, before 10 p.m. Now it's almost midnight. I wanted to do the loud things first. So yes, if you live in an apartment, definitely do your sawing earlier in the day so that your neighbors don't call the police. If you buy a big sheet of silver like this, you're probably gonna want to get one of these bench pins and a jeweler's saw. This is 22 gauge. I like it because it's thick enough to use for back plates, but it is less expensive than say like a 20 gauge, which would be my preference. 22 gauge is thin enough to be cut with shears, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because when you cut metal with shears, you're gonna bend the metal and then you won't have this like nice, perfect, flat piece of silver. You're gonna have to take the piece after you cut it out with shears and like hammer it flat again. It's just a pain. You want your metal to be as flat as possible so your bezel wire sits on it really nicely. Put your stone off to the side, again, very far away from your flame. Put your little piece of silver on your soldering station. And here it's helpful to have an old paintbrush so that you can dip it in your crusty flux and paint a nice layer on top of here. Then take your bezel wire and set that right on top of your silver so that none of it is like hanging over the edge. You want it to be surrounded by silver. Before you involve solder at all, you're gonna take your torch and you're just gonna go over it lightly so that the flux like bubbles up and dries out so that you can then add your solder and your solder won't like jump around because of the wet flux. Then you're gonna take medium flow solder. You're gonna cut small little chips. For this size stone, I'm gonna cut probably 4 little chips and place them on the inside around the edge. I spaced those little chips out pretty evenly around and pushed them all the way up to the walls of the bezel on the inside. Respirator check. Voiceover Liz is gonna take over while we solder this bezel so that I can protect my lungs. Not sponsored by Big Lung, just probably important. I would assume that this stuff is pretty toxic. The state of California definitely thinks so.
We're going to be using a pretty large flame here, not quite full blast, but just a little bit less. And here's a very important nugget of information for you to take on your metalsmithing journey. Solder is always going to flow towards heat. With that in mind, you're going to want to focus the blue tip of your flame on the outside of the bezel. The solder is sitting on the inside of the bezel and we want to pull it through so that it essentially glues these two components together. You're gonna want to move in slow, even circles around the outside of the bezel, and eventually you'll see the solder flow through. And you'll want to use your tweezers to move the piece around in circles to make sure that the solder has flowed all the way around.
Once you've made a little tiny Polly Pocket house for your stone, you're gonna take your shears. You can also do this with a jeweler's saw, but I personally like to do shears. I feel like it's a lot easier. And you're gonna cut away as much of this silver as you want. I personally don't really like to leave a lip around my stone setting, but you definitely can. I like to cut as close to the edge as I possibly can. You're left with a little curly-Q pigtail of silver that you can use as scrap later on. You can melt this down and hammer it out and use it for something else. And then you've got your bezel, which at the moment is jagged and not looking very nice. Since we've sworn off power tools, I'm gonna use a file for this. Usually I use my flex shaft and I go around it with a very abrasive bit to grind down the metal and get it flush. But you can also use a file, so that's what we're gonna do.
You're just gonna wanna follow the curve of your bezel with your file all the way around until you blend the back plate into the bezel wire. This started to hurt my fingers after a while, so I had to hold it with a towel, which was actually a lot more comfortable. Here you can see that it's flush, but it's rough from the file, so I tore off a little piece of sandpaper and continued to smooth out that seam.
Now we do need to have a little bit of a conversation. You're not in trouble. It's about solder. This is where I keep my solder, in this baggie that I definitely didn't light on fire. There are many different kinds of solder. There's paste solder, there's wire solder, there's sheet solder or chip solder. Most metalsmiths are ride or die for their favorite kind of solder. I personally am a sheet solder gal. I would advise you to start with sheet solder because that's what I think is the easiest, but you know, do your own research, do what you want to do. Whatever kind of solder you get, you are going to want to get easy flow, medium flow, and hard flow. When you're soldering a piece, you always want to start with hard flow and go down to medium flow as you go through the steps. Hard flow solder melts at a higher temperature than easy flow solder. So you start with the one that melts at the highest temperature so that by the time you get down to this one, you're not disrupting the other solder because this is melting way before these would melt. If that makes sense, this is kind of an advanced topic, and honestly, it could be its own video. A little example with the ring that we are making.
This is a little bit confusing, but stick with me. Each solder flows at a different temperature. Hard flows at 1450 Fahrenheit, medium flows at 1360 Fahrenheit, and easy flows at 1325 Fahrenheit. When we soldered together our bezel wire, we used hard flow solder. When we soldered together our ring band, we also used hard flow solder. We did so strategically because each of those joints were the first joint on each separate component of our ring, the bezel and the band. When we added the back plate to the bezel wire, we used medium flow solder. We did this because we'd already used hard flow on this component, and it takes less heat to flow medium flow than it does hard, so it doesn't reflow or disrupt our first joint. Now when we solder the bezel cup to the band, we're going to use easy flow solder. We've already used hard and medium flow, and since easy's flow temp is lower than both of those, it won't reflow other solder seams and risk moving things around on the ring.
Honestly, just trust me, you will get it. It's easy. You do the same shit every single time you make something, and you'll learn the steps. But that's solder class. You're dismissed. We're gonna go make the band now. For the wire, I am using a 10 gauge full round sterling silver wire. I'll link below exactly the metal that I'm using. Using thick full round wire is a little bit tricky because the underside is round as opposed to like a half round wire like this where the metal against your skin is flat. This is obviously round against your skin, and that messes up the sizing a little bit. So you're gonna wanna go up a size and a half to get the right size. Listen, maybe that's a little bit complex for like your very first lesson, but this is all I have to work with. And you know what? Get it out of the way now. Learn the tricks of the trade while you're still young. So I want to make this a size 8. I keep my sizes on the inside of this journal that Joanne Fabric sent me for getting 3 million views on TikTok. These are the measurements that I have found work really well. I've used these measurements for like 10 years now, and I find them to be very accurate. These are in millimeters, so if you would like to screenshot that, there you go. I want a size 8, which would be 60.6 millimeters, but like I said, I'm gonna make it a size and a half bigger, so I'm gonna make it at a 9.5, which is a 64.4. I'm gonna take my trusty cheapy plastic calipers that I got on Amazon for like $5. You can also use a ruler or like a tape measure, but you're just gonna measure out however much silver you're gonna need. Close enough, doesn't have to be exactly perfect, 64.4, 64.5, whatever. Lay your calipers down on your bench pin or your table or whatever. Straighten out a bit of your wire because it is gonna come wound up. Straighten a little piece out and then mark it with a Sharpie. If you're using a thick wire like this, you are gonna need a jeweler saw, or you're gonna need to order your wire in the exact measurements that you're gonna need. Like if you know you wanna make a size 8 ring, you can order wire in small increments.
A quick little example of how to order metal, you're either going to click the link that I've included below, or you can just go to any metal supplier's website and search for what you're looking for. You're going to see all the gauges laid out, and you'll select the gauge that you want, and then the amount of wire. If you have a saw, you'll just do increments in feet, most likely. Get like 2 feet of it, and then you can cut sections and make however many rings you want. If you need smaller pieces, you can do inches and partial inches. You can figure out how many inches it would be to make a size 8 ring, for example, and just order as close to that as you can. And then you'll see the price of the piece that you're ordering at the bottom, and then just click add to cart, obviously, like any other shopping experience.
But if you are gonna saw, you just lay this on your bench block in between and you cut right on that line that you made. And you do it really quietly so that your neighbors don't hate you. To make your life easier, you are going to want to anneal this piece of silver. It's going to make it a lot easier to bend. Annealing is basically just heating a piece of metal until it's red hot and it's glowing, and then quenching it in water, and that makes the metal really soft and a lot easier to shape into a ring band. So you're just going to lay that little piece of silver that you cut on your soldering block, and you're going to torch it. You'll start to see it turn bronzy colored, and then it'll start to go orange and then red. See how it's red hot is the term. I don't want to catch my hair on fire here, but get it to that red hot stage, and then quench it in some water. Nice. Dry it off with a towel that you do not care about, your designated metalsmithing towel. Now you're going to take your file and you're going to rest your piece of metal against something. If you didn't invest in one of these guys, you can just rest it against your table. These are really helpful. This one has like a notch cut out of it where you can sit the wire, and then you're just going to take your file, hold it perpendicular to the top of this wire, and you're just going to file it until it's as flat as you can get it. Just soft, even movements. And then you take your ring mandrel and you find the size that you're trying to make. In my case, an 8. I just like to sit the metal right up against the size that I'm doing, and then with my thumbs on either side, I just push so that the metal starts to curve, and you just push it with your fingers as far as you can until you get like a horseshoe shape. Once you got your little horseshoe, you're gonna take your pliers. Needle nose pliers work best for this. Grab one of the ends and fold it inward like that, and then flip it. Grab the other end, fold it inward to meet up with that one that you just folded, and you're just gonna keep going back and forth between the two, folding them in until they are very flush with one another. So you might have to push those two ends apart, kind of like a key ring, push them past each other a little bit, and then like pull back and snap it into place. You might need to just keep going down and up a little bit until they meet. You can use your fingers too if you need to like push them back and forth. And you just want to do that until they are as flush as you can possibly get them. If there's like a little bit of a gap, it's not that big of a deal. You're going to fill this with solder, and solder usually will fill like a little gap. If you can like just barely see some light through it, solder should fill that. If it's like a real big gap and the ends are like, you know, not meeting up at all, you might need to go back to your file and try to file those ends more flat. Okay, come down here. We're gonna solder this band together. Don't forget and don't skip your lung protection. You're gonna take your band and you are going to dip it in your flux. Mine is very crusty and dusty and musty and old, but whatever, it still works. Once your guy is coated in flux, you're gonna sit it on a flat section of your soldering block. Because this is the first time we're soldering on this band, we're gonna use hard flow solder. If you are using sheet solder, you're gonna cut a little piece with your shears. Okay, drop it on the ground 99.9% of the time. Be prepared to cut several pieces. About yay big. Then you're gonna take this little chip of solder, put it down on your soldering block, and you're gonna take that joint that you just created with your pliers, and you're gonna sit that joint right on top of that chip of solder. Start up your torch.
You're going to want to use a similar flame to the one that you just used when soldering the bezel and the back plate, not full blast, but pretty big. You'll start by doing circles around your entire band, again always using the hottest part of your flame, which is the tip of that blue cone. Once you see your solder start to flow, you'll direct your heat right on that joint, heat it from the top so that you're pulling the solder all the way through. Turn off your torch and quench per usual.
Okay, now for the moment my neighbors have not been waiting for. You're gonna hammer your band round on your ring mandrel. Your band should be like a little bit of a D shape right now. Slide it on your mandrel, push it down as far as you can with your hand. It should look a little something like that. And then if you're me at 10:09 p.m. in an upstairs apartment, you're gonna do this really slow and quiet. I think my boyfriend's pop might have been louder than I'm being, actually. So.
It's not a pop, it's a Waterloo.
Oh, excuse me, Waterloo. I'm so worried about the noise, I forgot to explain what I'm doing. Although I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I like to brace the ring mandrel against my body just to like keep it secure. If I wasn't turned to the side facing a camera, I would be sitting like this with it kind of like on my sternum, but up here works too. Don't like hurt yourself with it, but just kind of like brace it on your body and it makes it easier to turn, I think. Okay, that's all I'm doing. It's round enough. You're gonna hammer it until when you look down on it, you're not seeing any light around the ring. It's like flush with the mandrel. And I know that's probably impossible to see, but mine is right at an 8. So if you're getting 10 gauge round wire like me, a size and a half bigger is exactly what you wanna cut your metal at. If your ring is really stuck on the mandrel, sometimes it is, turn it upside down, hammer it like this, and it should come right off. Ta-da! A ring. We did it, Joe. We did it. Now we gotta solder these two together, which is arguably the hardest part of this entire project, but don't get discouraged because you've come so far and you're gonna do great. You've seen a ring before. The stone goes in here. The band is gonna connect to the back of this. So this is where we're gonna need our third hand. I don't know what we would do without it. You're gonna find a relatively flat spot on your soldering block, which gets harder with use. You're gonna find where you soldered the band together, and right where that little solder blob is, you're gonna put the ring into the third hand so that the third hand is grabbing that joint. And then you're gonna just finagle this until you think it is sitting straight and even. You'll want to get up and look at it from all different angles. Look at it from the side and adjust. Look at it from the top as well to see if it's crooked at all. And once you think it's sitting as pretty as it possibly can be, take your paintbrush, gently paint it with a little flux as to not disturb the placement that you just worked so hard on. And then finally, easy flow solder comes out to play. You're gonna take a relatively large chunk of easy flow solder, something a little bit like that. Respirator check, voiceover Liz, tell them how it's done.
My pleasure. Okay, same flame as the last two solders, and you're going to start by just burning off that flux. Heat it until it turns crusty and white, and then grab your solder chip with your tweezers and sit it on the back of your bezel right where your band is touching it. You'll start by heating everything up in circles, the entire band and bezel, and then you'll start to focus on where you want to pull your solder through. Remember, solder flows toward heat, so to pull your solder from one side of the band to the other, you'll want to heat that area from the back. You can use your tweezers to kind of push the solder up against the band, try to coax it through, and you'll see a line of shining silvery solder at that joint, and you'll know that you have successfully soldered them both together. Hooray! Your third hand will be hot, so be super careful when you're taking your ring out of there and then quench in water. Next, you'll want to check your ring to make sure that the stone setting is sitting evenly on the band. Set it on a flat surface to make sure it's not leaning to one side or the other. Put it on your finger to see how it looks. My band was a little bit crooked, which seems daunting, I know, but it's super easy to fix. Just sit your ring bezel down on your soldering station and hold the band tightly with your tweezers. As you reheat everything, pull your band in the direction that you want the band to go. Once the solder flows, you should be able to manipulate it to be straight with your tweezers.
Okay, the ring looks great. It's nice and even. We are now on to the finishing steps. The next step is pickling. Pickling is going to remove the fire scale, and the fire scale is that brown, green, gross discoloration on the silver. I personally like to use a non-chemical pickle, which is white vinegar and salt. And when I'm at my studio, I have a little crock pot that I turn on and warm up and let my jewelry chill in there. At home, I don't have that. I just take like a microwave safe bowl and I fill it with some vinegar, some salt, and I pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes. My microwave is a piece of crap, so 2 minutes might be too long for you, but basically you want the vinegar to be pretty hot. Not boiling hot, but pretty warm. And then I put a lid on my bowl and I just leave it in the microwave with my jewelry inside so that it stays nice and toasty. Obviously, don't forget that your metal is in the microwave if you need to reheat the vinegar. It's not ideal, but I found that it works for me when I'm working from home.
After an hour or so in the pickle, your silver will turn a nice dusty white color, and now you are ready to oxidize. I like to use liver of sulfur gel. Liver of sulfur produces a really nice dark gray color on your metal, and there is another option called Black Max that is a much darker black color, so do some research, see what you like best. Anyway, to use liver of sulfur, you'll pour boiling water over your piece in an old jar that you will never eat or drink from again. Pick up some of that stank gel on your tweezers and mix it around in the water. Check your piece, and if it's not getting dark enough, add a little bit more gel. I didn't film this next part for some reason, but you're gonna want to neutralize your ring by putting it in a bath of water and baking soda. You also do not want to pour your liver of sulfur mixture down the drain without neutralizing it. There are many ways to dispose of liver of sulfur, so I will let you do your own research to see which method is right for you.
Hi, it's been over 24 hours. It is now 12:30 a.m. the next day. I'm gonna finish this ring. It's nice and oxidized, dark gray. And the next step in the process is to file the ring band where we soldered the band together. There's gonna be like a little bit of a glob of solder, and the half round file is really helpful for blending that into the rest of the metal so that you can't tell where the seam is. The easiest way to do this is to brace your ring up against something like this, or even up against the edge of your table, and you just take the flat part of your file and you're gonna follow the curve of the band. You're gonna go along the sides and the top and just follow the curve and blend that solder in to the rest of the ring. Little something like this, where you can't really see a bump or a line anymore where you soldered it. And then you're gonna wanna also do that to the inside of the ring using this curved part of your half round file. So you set your ring down on a surface like this. You take the curved part, put that on the inside of the ring, and you're just gonna twist. Push the ring forward, twist on this side, twist in the middle, push the ring forward, twist right here on this like inner side until you get all of that to blend as well. I think that looks pretty good. Can't really see a solder seam anywhere. And then again, since we're not using power tools, I just ripped off a little piece of sandpaper and I'm going to just try to like blend out the file marks and make them a little bit smoother. I only have 2 grits of sandpaper at home, but you could get like the whole array of, you know, grittiest to smoothest and really smooth out your metal. It doesn't really matter that much to me because I'm gonna be making this ring have a matte finish and we're gonna use pumice powder for that. That's something that I forgot to put in the little intro of things you're gonna need, but you're also gonna need pumice powder if you want to do this same kind of matte finish that I'm gonna do. I think the pumice powder will be able to smooth it out more and get it to that like final satin finish, which I'll show you soon. But for now, we're gonna set the stone. Exciting. And here's the band after I went over it with some sandpaper. I just got rid of like the file marks. Okay, so here is our cute little onyx stone. This little ring clampy tool that I can't remember the name of, I'll put it right here when I Google it. I said this was optional, but I am gonna use it. I think they're like 10 bucks and they're really helpful for setting stones or for filing small pieces of metal, anything where you really need like a good grip. So you just put your ring in there, obviously with your stone setting facing up, and then you plop your stone right inside of its bezel. Hopefully it fits. If it doesn't fit right away, you might have to take your burnisher tool and go inside of the bezel and kind of open it up a little bit. Sometimes the bezel will get a little bit compressed as you're like making the ring, and you have to kind of go in there and just like widen it a little bit. And first I'm gonna take my bezel pusher, this little mushroom guy. I'm gonna brace my ring up against this, or you could do it up against a table. If you're not using one of these, you can just hold the ring and brace it up against a table, just so you have something solid to push on. And then you're gonna push with your bezel pusher at opposite ends. Like I'm gonna go here, 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 here at 4 points. So I'm gonna push the bezel in here, then I'm gonna turn it, push it in here at the opposite side, then over here, and then over here. Hopefully you can see that because the stone is so dark, but I've got it pushed in at 4 points and there's diagonal points now that are popping out that I need to push in. So I'm gonna go over here in this corner and then flip it and go in this corner. And you're just pushing this wire, smoothing it onto the stone, honestly as hard as you can without slipping and smacking into the stone, because if you do hit the stone too hard, you can crack it, so you have to be careful. But I'm just pushing forward and I kind of like smooth to the side as I push. Push in, smooth around. Push in, smooth around. Sometimes it helps to hold the bezel pusher like this so you can get a really good grip on it. And you just want to make sure that all of the metal around the stone is pushed forward, that none of it looks gappy or is like sticking out anywhere. And then once you've got all the metal pushed down as hard as you can around the stone, you take your burnisher and you hold it kind of like a potato peeler and you kind of go around this almost like you're peeling a carrot or something. I don't know, maybe that's a really bad analogy. That's kind of what I always think of when I'm doing this. But basically you're just using like the sharp edge of this burnisher to push that bezel like really, really hard. And you can like go back and forth, just like really smooth down the metal around the edge of the stone. Okay, stone is set. And as you can see, the metal got a little bit messed up from the tools. So again, since we're not using power tools, I'm just gonna take a little piece of sandpaper and go around and be very careful not to scuff up the stone with the sandpaper. You can even put like some painter's tape over the stone if you don't trust yourself to stay away from the stone. But I'm just gonna go around, try to blend out any tool marks. Okay, so our last step is to give our ring its final finish, which like I said is going to be a satin finish. And a satin finish is just like a fluffy, nice, soft matte. There are many ways to achieve this, but how I like to do it is with pumice powder. You can get this on Amazon. It's basically just ground up pumice stone, like those things that you use on your crusty, dry feet. People will mix this with like face wash and use it as an exfoliant, I guess, on your face. But it's also really good for giving a satin finish to metal. So that's how I use it. It's pretty cheap. Here you'll see I'm reusing a cottage cheese container lid because we're at home, we're just gonna use whatever random shit we can find. I've got some water in here because you wanna get your fingers wet on the tips, and then you dip your fingers in the pumice powder and you just rub them over top of the metal. And this is gonna take the oxidation off of the metal wherever you rub. And it's also gonna smooth out the metal where we went over it with sandpaper, and it should blend everything in really nicely. So you just wanna rub the metal everywhere that you can reach with your fingers. Go around the bezel with your thumb. You'll want to go on the inside of the ring too. Just basically rub this thing down all over. You can try to go underneath and give kind of like a gradient where it's rubbed off along the edge, and as you go in further it's dark. It's kind of a cool look. Same with up here by where the stone sits on the band. You're not going to be able to get your fingers all the way in there, but I think it gives it kind of a cool look where it's darker under the stone and it kind of ombres out into the satin finish where there's no dark metal. And then you just rinse this off in your sink and your ring is done. Ta-da! Wow, look at that satin. See what I mean by like a soft matte? You just kind of want to rub your face on it. It's my favorite finish. And the cool thing about a satin finish too is that it looks very matte right now. And if you or your customer, imagine that, what if you had customers? If you or your customer continue to use the pumice powder on it regularly, it will stay matte. But if you don't, just as you wear it and as it bumps up against your skin, your clothes, whatever, it polishes itself up. So it's not gonna stay completely matte like this forever. It's not gonna polish itself up to like a shiny mirror finish. You're gonna need a Dremel tool or a flex shaft if you wanna learn how to do that kind of a finish. But it'll polish itself up to like just like a normal, you know, how like a normal ring looks worn and shiny and whatever. It'll just kind of do that over time. I've been making jewelry for about 10 years now, and this ring is not perfect. Something that I do want to say about handmade jewelry is it's okay if your handmade jewelry looks handmade, because guess what? Your hands made it, and that's like so cool. I think that's the coolest thing about art and about jewelry. This ring shouldn't look like it was made by a machine because you made it with your hands, and that's what makes it like so special and cool. So if you did this, or if you're thinking about doing this, pat yourself on the back. I am proud of you. Way to freaking go. Maybe keep your first one and wear it forever and be super proud of yourself too. If you watched this whole video, you're awesome. Thank you so much. Subscribe if you like to see things that I make. Sometimes it's rings, sometimes it's tutorials, sometimes it's crochet, sometimes it's a giant something that's coming soon that is not either of those, and it's gonna be really cool. So stay tuned. Thanks for subscribing and stuff. It means a lot to me. I like making these videos. I'll catch ya in another one. Goodbye.